The carnage wreaked by the War of 1914 to 1918 was so immense that it became known as the Great War, a war to end all wars. Back in the day, there was a real desire that a war on this scale should never ever happen again. It was believed that if people were reminded of the lives lost in the war, then there would be some reluctance to be involved in another. On Tuesday the 11th of November 1919, on the first anniversary of the Armistice, Britain held its first Remembrance Day. It has been a national feature ever since. This video of today's Remembrance Sunday Parade in Brandon demonstrates it is still going strong. Another legacy our ancestors left us are the memorials sited in every village, town, city, community, sports club and factory across the length and breadth of not just Britain but overseas too. It was foreseen that these memorials would see people connect with the names on them, local names, and pass down the stories behind each one. In doing so, people would see these names belong to people who were less warriors but more like me and you. Normal people dragged into a war of their time. Brandon's memorial, unveiled in 1920, features the names of 65 Brandon lads killed in the Great War. Brandon, being Brandon, it was never going to be an easy road to getting this memorial completed. St. Peter's Church was perhaps the first to raise funds towards a permanent memorial to honour Brandon's war dead. In a thanksgiving held at the time of the Armistice, the church kicked off its efforts with the congregation donating £10, 14 shillings and 8p. The church's aim was to raise enough funds for a decorative bronze plate. While St. Peter's was already making plans, Brandon dignitaries formed a committee to oversee the creation of the town's war memorial. This was typical of the old way of making decisions. The old way being any time before the war. Wealthy people forming committees and informing the residents of what was going to happen. The trouble was, many residents had given so much to the war. Their youth, limbs, their loved ones, or even their sanity. While they perceived many dignitaries stayed at home and simply carried on their business as usual. Brandon folk were restless and they wanted more say. Nonetheless, it all started positive enough when in January 1919 the committee discussed what form the town's memorial should take. Colonel Boyd Hamilton of Brandon House presided over the meeting and put forward a suggestion from Brandon businessman George Wood of a stone plinth on Market Hill. Colonel Hamilton's wife Janie informed the committee that the local council had even been offered a captured German machine gun as a war trophy, so perhaps this could be mounted on top of the plinth and the dead men's names inscribed upon the plinth. The fur factory owner, Albert Rout, put forward the idea of a cottage hospital, but Dr. Trotter, who knew about these things, claimed it would be too costly when you considered the wages of doctors and nurses to run it. Dr. Trotter then suggested his own idea, which was a plinth sited near St. Peter's Church. The Reverend Mensink of the Baptist Church claimed to have the support from townsfolk in matching Dr. Trotter's idea and proposed the cemetery as the location for the memorial. Mr. Edgington, headmaster of the local schools, agreed to this proposal, as did the committee made up of 7 men and 5 women. Dr. Trotter then raised an idea of treating the ex-servicemen to a posh dinner and entertainment. It was agreed to form another committee to discuss this further. While committees formed committees to discuss the various memorials, one Brandon war veteran received his own personal memorial service in March 1919. He had survived the war, come back to Brandon and then gone to work in a timber yard near the railway station. It was in the timber yard of George Wood, who was serving on the War Memorial Committee, that poor 34-year-old William Royal met his end. One of the belt-driven saw machines had a sunken pit below, which had become flooded by winter rain. William jumped into the pit to bail the water out, but in doing so, his loose overcoat got entangled into the belt, pulling him onto the machine. The impact smashed his skull, both legs and arms, killing him instantly. He may have survived the mud of Flanders, but it was the mud of Brandon that did for him. Had he died a few months earlier in Flanders, his name would have been forever immortalised on a memorial, but as it is, he is now largely forgotten about. Obscurity became the fate of all those who survived the war. In May 1919, the War Memorial Committee reported that they had received donations amounting to over £200 and were seeking to raise even more money. With a decent sum in the bank, they set about seeking estimates to design and build the memorial. With reference to Dr. Trotter's earlier idea of treating the ex-servicemen, this came to fruition in the middle of May when the White Hart Hotel hosted 40 Brandon war veterans for a meal. They then all transferred over to the Church Institute for entertainment laid on by the organisers and the servicemen themselves. Two specific acts stand out for reasons I will go to in a second. Henry Lydiard had lost a leg in the war and he played out a character sketch, while Frederick Gentle, who was a Brandon councillor, butcher and one of the organisers of the event, sang songs alongside his daughter. 2 days later, Mr. Gentle assaulted the disabled war veteran, knocking him to the ground and causing outrage among the town's residents and ex-servicemen. That night, a mob of about 1,000 people from Brandon's population of about 2,500 gathered outside Mr. Gentle's home, damaging doors and windows. People looted his butcher shop and attempts were made to get at Mr. Gentle with threats to kill him. Brandon, it seemed, had had enough of the old order literally pushing them about. At Brandon Police Court, Frederick Gentle was found guilty of assaulting Mr. Lydiard and was fined for doing so. In June, the ringleaders of the mob were sent for trial at Bury St Edmunds, but the magistrates there felt it better to bound them over rather than send them to prison. The men had seen outrageous scenes during their time in the war, so they were dealt with compassionately. And in any case, the nation was looking forward to celebrating the signing of peace terms. As 1919 drew to a close, the war memorial was still no nearer to being finalised. The German machine gun promised by the council had been displayed in shop windows on the first anniversary of the Armistice, but had since been disposed of. With other villages already unveiling their memorials, the big question was, when would Brandon get its one, and finally see closure on this war? As the winter of 1920 passed into spring, St. Peter's Church revealed their first memorial. They had set their sights on raising money for a decorative plate, but their congregation had been so generous that this idea was surpassed by a more elaborate bronze tablet. The church held a very public memorial service on Market Hill before proceeding to the church to unveil it. Among those taking part was Percy Wilby, who had been a youth leader at the church before the war. He had been wounded twice during it, including one occasion when a Bible kept in his chest pocket bore the impact from an enemy bullet and saved his life. And then, after the war, he had suffered shell shock. Reminders of the war were still very much evident in Brandon. Less obvious was any progress to erect a memorial in the town cemetery. Toward the end of summer 1920, agitated residents and ex-servicemen put pressure on the War Memorial Committee. They weren't the only ones. The National Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Sailors and Soldiers, the forerunner to the Royal British Legion, were also taking an interest. Brandon was already on their radar following the assault on Henry Lydiard the previous year, leading to the Federation writing to Brandon Parish Council demanding that his attacker, Frederick Gentle, be removed as a parish councillor. A demand the council simply ignored. The Federation now took on Brandon's War Memorial Committee. They informed the committee they were distressed at the lack of progress and the cemetery was the wrong place for the memorial. They claimed to have the backing of many ex-servicemen for the memorial to be placed on Market Hill, an idea the committee had thrown out at their first meeting 18 months previously. The Federation stated that other local communities had put theirs in public places and protected them with metal railings, something that Brandon should do rather than put it within a church cemetery. Would the committee, under pressure from the Federation, deliberate further and possibly drag the memorial into 1921? Thankfully, The committee stood strong and resisted calls for the memorial to be moved. However, the threat of intervention from the Federation may have added urgency because over the next 2.5 months, the committee hired a contractor to build the memorial and announced it would be unveiled to the town on Sunday, the 17th of October 1920. Hundreds of people gathered in the town cemetery to observe the dedication of the memorial, which had a huge Union Jack draped over it. The ceremony began with a muffled peal of bells from St. Peter's Church, and at 3 p.m. the dedication commenced. Local dignitaries addressed the crowd. Dr. Trotter, who by now was chairman of the War Memorial Committee, stood first and suggested he was speaking on behalf of everyone who had donated to the memorial. He spoke of how sad it was that so many Brandon lads should have fallen in the war, and then suggested that everyone think of every town and village that had suffered too, which would then give them an idea of the number of sons this nation had lost. This, he said, was the sad side, but there was hope. He hoped that, in years to come, those men would be remembered when a great many of those living today would be forgotten, for their names would be indelibly written in the pages of history. They would be remembered by generations yet unborn. Dr. Trotter then invited Colonel Spragg to step forward to unveil the memorial. Colonel Spragg lived in Brandon's North Court and was an ex-soldier, having served in the Boer War and seen service in the Great War too. He was not the first choice, for Colonel Hamilton had been invited to unveil the memorial, but he was out of town and could not return on account of bad weather and the industrial strikes in support of coal miners crippling all transport. Britain was still a nation in conflict. Anyway, it was Colonel Spragg who pulled away the Union Jack to unveil the memorial to the town. Being an ex-soldier, his words reflected those of pre-war Britain, in that he suggested there could be no more glorious death than to die in the field as these men had done. Other ex-soldiers, standing in the crowd, knew that death was not usually instantaneous. Mortally wounded men took time to die. Some Brandon men caught disease and died. Others died as a result of accidents. There was nothing glorious about their deaths. The memorial was revealed to be a large cross made from white Portland stone and embellished with a crusader's sword on one side. The plinth was headed with the words "The War 1914 to 1918" and inscribed with the names of Brandon men who had died in the war. After the unveiling, the hymn On the Resurrection Morning was sung by the massed choirs of all Brandon churches. The rector of St. Peter's, Reverend P.D. Johnson, then performed the dedication. 2 buglers sounded the last post. The assembled crowd bowed their heads as prayers were read out. The hymn, Peace, Perfect Peace, was sung and underlined the tone of the service. Lastly, the buglers sounded Reveille. After the service, families of those killed took turns to lay wreaths and flowers at the base of the memorial in memory of their loved ones. One of the most prominent floral displays came from Brandon Fire Brigade, which saw a wreath of coloured flowers set upon a white background. This is just about visible in this black and white photo of the time. Through the years since 1920, Brandon residents have remembered their war dead. Initially, they remembered the 65 names from the Great War. The Great War then became known as the First World War once the Second World War had concluded in 1945, leading to the addition of 23 more names to remember. Another name was added when a Brandon lad was killed in the Korean War. Every year they are remembered.
Sons of this place, let this of you be said, that ye live are worthy of your dead. These gave their lives that ye live may reap a richer harvest, here ye fall asleep.